We'll go as quickly as we can.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And I am happy to be here today to offer some insights from the work of the task force, which was given the mandate, as you know, by the government in June 2016 to consult and provide independent advice on the design of a new legislative and regulatory framework. Shaped by extensive consultations, the task force report delivered to ministers and made public on December 13, 2016, provided 85 recommendations. The advice contained in our report is the culmination of more than 5 months of work. We traveled across the country and heard from Canadians, including parents, youth, and patients. We spent time with experts and organizations who shared their diverse perspectives. Indigenous experts, leaders, their representative organizations, and elders were invited to participate in a variety of task force engagement activities, including an Indigenous Peoples Roundtable. These opportunities provided the task force with valuable perspectives on the interests and concerns of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We met with officials from provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous governments who emphasized the need for close collaboration amongst all levels of government. We traveled to Colorado and Washington and spoke to officials in the government of Uruguay to learn from their experiences in enacting systems for legal access to cannabis. We also received close to 30,000 responses from experts, organizations, and Canadians who took the time to respond to our online questionnaire, including major Canadian associations such as the CMA, the CNA, the Canadian Pharmacists Association, the Canadian Trucking Association, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and many others. Through your committee hearings, you have undoubtedly heard a diverse variety of perspectives, just as we did. In developing our recommendations, we sought to strike a balance between implementing appropriate restrictions in order to minimize the harms associated with cannabis use and providing adult access to a regulated supply of cannabis while reducing the scope and scale of the illicit market. Our recommendations are grounded in caution that leads to an approach that is more restrictive at the outset of legalization and subject to adjustment over time if evidence supports it. This balanced approach has guided where we landed on some of the areas that have generated debate. I can speak to 3 of these areas, which I understand have been of particular interest to this committee and other committees studying Bill C-45. My co-chair, Dr. Mark Ware, will speak to other issues. We heard disparate views regarding the minimum age limit for the purchase of cannabis. The task force gave serious consideration to the various recommendations, ranging from 18 to 25 years. We recognized the increased risks associated with the use of cannabis at an early age. Yet, we also recognize these risks also exist for other substances and activities that are legally permitted at the age of 18. In Canadian society, 18 is generally accepted as the age of young adulthood. We believe that with appropriate information, young adults can make informed decisions affecting their lives. Further, the evidence shows that adults from 18 to 24 are the segment of the population most likely to consume cannabis. Setting the age for legal access too high will lead to a range of negative consequences, such as leading young adults to continue to purchase cannabis on the illicit market. That market has no quality control or other assurances. In proposing a federal minimum age of 18 and enabling provinces and territories to set it higher, should they choose, we aim to balance the need to protect minors with the objective of reducing the illicit market. A second issue that garnered significant interest was home cultivation. We heard concerns about the health and safety risks of home cultivation, enforcement challenges, and fears about diversion to the illicit market. However, these concerns generally pertain to larger scale grow operations, particularly in relation to so-called designated growers in the medicinal program. That is why we recommended that the government immediately take up a review of that category. Arguments in favor of allowing home cultivation are premised on the belief that it can be done safely and responsibly with appropriate limits and safeguards. As in other areas, technology is transforming home cultivation. Ultimately, the task force concluded that allowing limited home cultivation, along with a prohibition on dangerous manufacturing processes, reasonable security measures, and oversight by local authorities, appropriately accounted for health and safety concerns, while providing a reasonable framework for enabling small-scale cultivation of cannabis for personal use by law-abiding adults, much like we currently see with home brewing of alcohol. A third issue that we examined closely was whether there should be a limit on the amount of cannabis an individual could have in their possession or on their person at any given time. Many law enforcement officials argued in favor of personal possession limits. Although quantity alone is not indicative of trafficking, it can be an indicator when examined in conjunction with other factors, for example, carrying large amounts of cash, that could help in determining whether to lay trafficking charges. The task force also heard from a number of respondents who argued that there is no possession limit on alcohol and tobacco, and that a personal possession limit would be impractical to enforce. Based on careful consideration of these views and the experiences of other jurisdictions which have legalized, the task force recommended that the amount of non-medical cannabis that individuals can carry on their person in a public place should be limited to 30 grams. It is our view that this is a reasonable precaution that may also provide some clarity to law enforcement efforts. I would add that based on the conversations we had with law enforcement officials, experts, and other stakeholders, the idea of a possession limit for individuals in their homes would be arbitrary, hard to enforce, and, dare I say, paternalistic. To conclude, I would reiterate one of the observations we made in our final report. No matter how long we wait, and how much we prepare, it will not change the fact that the regulation of cannabis is a complex, groundbreaking policy initiative. There is no doubt that we will continue to learn as this initiative unfolds, and that flexibility and an open mind will be required in the months and years following implementation. As we have heard everywhere we went, there will be surprises, regardless of how thoughtful we believe we have been. Our challenge will be to respond with wisdom and with proportionality to those surprises. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ware.
Merci beaucoup. Je suis ici aujourd'hui de vous.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted here to outline for you my perspectives with regard to the legalization of cannabis based on my professional experience as a doctor who helps patients with chronic pain, as a clinical researcher as well, who uses the therapeutic characteristics of cannabis, and also as vice chair of this task force on cannabis legalization and regulation. I'm very proud and delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you today, and I thank you for your very committed deliberations and for offering me the possibility to appear before you, because this is a groundbreaking situation for Canada.
To disclose any financial relationships that could be perceived as conflicts of interest. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I declare that my institution receives funding from licensed producers of cannabis for clinical studies, and I currently consult for companies developing cannabinoid therapeutics. I've spent close to 20 years studying the health effects of cannabis, particularly in pain management, with grants from federal, provincial agencies, as well as pharmaceutical companies. While I fully acknowledge that there is more work to be done, I'm convinced of the potential therapeutic value of cannabis and its constituents. This is not an ideological position, but one I base on my understanding of cannabis the plant and its components, our endogenous cannabinoid system, and recognizing an unmet need for novel approaches to many disabling conditions, including chronic pain. Throughout my career, I have recognized and respected the diversity of opinions on cannabis from both medical and non-medical perspectives. And I've come to think of the dichotomy of medical and non-medical use as an artificial distinction. Cannabis use is undertaken for a range of reasons: from purely therapeutic to purely pleasurable. A medical cannabis user may appreciate the sense of well-being that cannabis can cause, while a non-medical user may actually be self-medicating for a number of reasons such as anxiety or insomnia. I fully appreciate that cannabis misuse is also a significant concern. For many of the reasons that the Senate has heard, including the potential effects of cannabis on a wide range of physiological systems, including the brain, heart, and lungs. Many of these effects are age and dose dependent, but importantly, they are also influenced by other social determinants of health, which we cannot ignore. In many areas, there is uncertainty as to the size of the effect, its clinical significance, and the direction of causality. The endogenous cannabinoid system is an important regulator of neurological development and activity. This may be illustrated by the fact that cannabis may either relieve anxiety or cause it, may reduce nausea or worsen it. There are many examples of such apparently opposite effects, but they make sense when you understand the underlying cannabinoid neurophysiology. There is enormous variability in the plant, in our ways of consuming it, and in our individual responses to its components. These observations have regulatory implications. As a researcher, I'm fully aware of ongoing attempts to consider cannabis and cannabinoids as pharmaceutical drugs, as natural health products, even as a potential veterinary therapy. During my tenure on the task force, I became aware of comparisons of cannabis regulations to those of alcohol and tobacco, including the comparative health and economic impacts of these substances in our society. As I'm sure the senators have come to appreciate, cannabis does not fit easily into any existing regulatory framework. This is why the task force recommended the Cannabis Act be put forward as a standalone piece of legislation. It is designed to consider the whole range of cannabis, including the industrial uses of hemp, which should not be forgotten as having economic potential as food, fiber, and an important source of bioactive cannabinoids. I suggest to the Senate that with legalization and regulation of cannabis, we are engaged in a paradigm shift in the way we consider drugs, from drugs of abuse to drugs as pharmaceuticals. Our attempts to borrow from other regulatory frameworks inevitably expose fundamental differences in the way such regulations aim to minimize risk and maximize benefit. It's important to note that what has led us to this paradigm shift has been unfolding in Canada over many years, beginning in 1998, when the government provided for the creation of an industrial hemp industry in Canada, continued with the introduction of a national regulatory framework on cannabis for medical purposes in 2001. It's important to emphasize that the scientific research community has been preparing for this shift. The question of legalization has fostered communities of natural, clinical, and social scientists who are actively developing the research and education agenda needed to support and inform this changing policy. Universities are establishing cannabis research centers of excellence. Medical societies are hosting cannabis keynotes and workshops. Networks of practitioners, researchers, policymakers, and industry are forming and engaging. There is a recognition that with legalization comes an opportunity for dialogue, for innovative policymaking, and for targeted research, from plant to policy, to expand our understanding of cannabis and its effects. Canada has an unprecedented opportunity to be a global leader in this regard. This work does not come without challenges. Access to funding, materials, and analytic capacity are obvious limitations, but the stigma associated with cannabis cannot be ignored. Just the smell of cannabis generates powerful and emotional responses deeply rooted in our social conditioning. Legalization is an opportunity to better inform our understanding of health impacts. It is an opportunity to improve our ways of measuring cannabis use, to calibrate such use against potential risk. In our task force report, we called for flexibility in policy to respond to emerging data and lessons learned. The legalization and regulation of cannabis is not a single point in time, but an organic process that must learn and grow. I began this testimonial with a declaration of relationships and a clinical perspective. I believe we must all acknowledge and respect the therapeutic potential of cannabis and cannabinoids and preserve a medical perspective on the drug. This will stimulate research and education efforts to benefit patients and healthcare professionals and will facilitate meaningful and informed decision-making between them. Legalization allows trials of cannabis to come out of the courtroom and into the clinic. We must each recognize and respect our own perspectives and core beliefs. acknowledge our potential biases, and work to overcome them. We have to think beyond politics. The Cannabis Act is important, timely, and necessary. In closing, I offer this statement as a way of framing the paradigm shift in which we are engaged. Think of cannabis not as a dangerous drug with potential benefits, but as a useful plant with potential risks. Thank you.